Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I am Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Rod Bennett, author of Bad Shepherds, The Dark Years in Which the Faithful Thrived While Bishops Did the Devil's Work. Published by Sophia Institute Press, available through our EWTN Religious Catalog. Great to see you there, Rod.
Good to see you again.
You know, from Four Witnesses through the apostasy, it's been about 5 years or so since I guess we talked, maybe 3 years or so.
Well, actually, the apostasy that wasn't, we talked in 17, so it
okay,
hasn't been that long.
It just seems longer at this point in time. But Bad Shepherds, you know, somebody would say, uh-oh, you know, he must have saw the headlines, decided he's going to run out this quickie book about what's wrong with the church now, but that's not the case, right?
No, actually, it's something that had been on my heart for a little while. It's my specialty is church history, so not that I'm an expert, but a buff. And people who may have read the other books know that that's what I like to do, is tell interesting stories from
Well, what
from
jumps off
history.
at people, somebody would say, times the faithful thrived while the bishops did the devil's work. And it is interesting, and if you read the history of the church, you realize where the laity has come forward so often. Some people have said, you know, all the heresies ultimately came from the clergy at different times. But to say they were doing the devil's work, isn't that a little over the top?
Well, that's why I wrote the book, so you would see that it's not really. In fact, if I were going to nail down carefully what my motivation was for writing, I think people should be concerned about the current problems in the church, but they shouldn't be overwhelmed or dismayed.
So in a sense, this gives people a context to realize we're not necessarily dealing with something that's new, that in many cases, as bad as it is right now, as you document, there were certain times where you could clearly say it was worse.
It has been worse, and that is what a lot of people don't realize is that, you know, I mentioned at one point in the book that we may have been feeding our people on too much of a cotton candy diet. When we continuously talk about saints and heroes and all the rest of it, and never about the bad actors.
Right.
We give people the impression that it's normal, or that sanctity is normal.
Right, we have
in
this
the church
hagiography going on with virtually everybody. You know, it's interesting in reading this book. I was thinking about the fact that you read some of these things and it's really believe it or not. And I noticed you dedicated this to a guy named Ripley, but it's not the same Ripley, right?
It is the same Ripley, actually.
Is it really?
Yes, I dedicated the book to
Robert Ripley.
That's right.
Because his first name was actually Leroy.
That's right. That's the L.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So he wrapped it around. Okay.
Some of the first books I read as a young man of any kind, my extracurricular reading, were the Ripley's Believe It or Not books.
Okay.
And he was always telling some crazy story.
So I saw that and I'm like, well, Ripley's first name was Leroy, not okay.
Yeah. So he was always telling some crazy story about some incredibly crazy event that happened back in history. And I realized as I was writing the book that I was slipping into my Robert Ripley voice. I was he had sort of schooled me in how to tell these stories about really crazy, unbelievably shocking events in the life of the church that you wouldn't really believe. It is a bit like a Believe It or Not.
And when you say that, you say in the style, let's say, of Ripley, what do you think that means?
Just a way of trading off of people's false expectations. I mean, again, because we have, and rightfully so, focused on the saints and the heroes, there is a lot of entertainment value, so to speak, in an odd way, of pointing out some of these crazy stories. In fact, I would be surprised if Robert Ripley didn't feature the story of the cadaver synod in one of his Believe It or Nots. This was the episode during the Dark Ages where one of the popes, one of the bad shepherds of my title, actually hated his predecessor so much, Pope Formosus, that he had him dug up and put on trial, had a deacon stand next to the body to answer for the Pope should he choose, as many expected, to exercise his right to remain silent. And then they took the body, condemned him, threw him into the Tiber River, and all of this happened right there in the papal palace.
Right. There's another one where, is that the same one where they break off the fingers?
That's right, yeah, because he'd use that to do his ordinations with and all the rest of it, yeah.
Right,
So this is straight out of Ripley's Believe It or Not, and in fact, it probably is a Ripley's Believe It or Not.
And speaking of Ripley, you talk about the fact that you put a lot of work into this, there's a lot of history in it, but you're not a trained historian, so there may be a couple of howlers or two. Have anybody found any of those howlers?
Not yet. I expected that you might be ready. You're a pretty intelligent person.
Well, I'm not being at the moon yet. So far, I found a lot of interesting things. You say also, I'd be very sorry if anyone were to take this work as a veiled stab and any modern churchman not yet proved beyond a reasonable doubt to be guilty of wrongdoing. And then you go on to quote St. Paul.
Yeah, Paul was careful to inculcate a virtue that really goes back to the Old Testament, to the Ten Commandments. Honor your father and your mother.
Right.
The church is our mother, the popes are our holy father, and we call all of our clergy father.
Right.
So there's warnings against breaking that commandment.
It's interesting, too, in the introduction here, you speaking of mother and father, you talk about your Baptist mother, and you talk about the fact that she worked with a bunch of evangelical clergymen, and that there had been only one who didn't end up being a challenge to her faith. Why did you put that in?
Well, that's something that that impressed me early on, with this idea that when clergy do let the flock down, there is a danger of people finding their faith affected. And it shouldn't be, I suppose. In other words, we all know that our clergy are human beings and that they're as prone to temptation and folly and sin as any of the rest of us. But that connection, I guess, is what I'm exploring in the book, is the relationship between losing your faith over a clergyman's sins.
Right. And also the idea, I think, which is good for all of us to kind of, and certainly I think in the past might have been what Catholics did in true triumphalism, the kind of looking at what was going on at the 700 Club or, PTL or something else, and saying, oh, well, it's terrible that these things are happening in these Protestant ministries.
Well, what goes around comes around.
Exactly.
Yeah?
And likewise, even today, on the other side, to say, people who are looking and say, oh, look at the disaster of this Catholic Church, see, it's the horror of Babylon, without realizing these kinds of human situations occur everywhere.
Well, this is something that I bring out in the introduction, I'd like to bring out here, and that is, if we do have any non-Catholic viewers watching the program, they might be inclined to say, well, if you've got these terrible clergy who have really done calamitous things through the centuries, I mean, the whole book is one horror story after another, with a purpose.
Right.
But if they were to conclude from that, as I did myself before I was a Catholic, that how can this church really have been established by God if people like this have been running it? How can the Pope call himself the Vicar of Christ if he's behaving more like the Emperor Nero?
Right.
And the surprising answer that I found in the pages of Scripture itself is the fact that Jesus, we're told, the angel Gabriel told us, Jesus sits on the throne of his father David.
Right.
And I can count on my Protestant friends out there to know that the throne that David established had some real rogues that sat on it.
And you kind of list those.
In fact, out of 39 kings that followed David on that throne, 31 of them were bad.
Right.
In fact, many of them were spectacularly bad.
Right.
And so if that proves, if the sins of the popes, and there haven't been many popes that were bad, but if the sins of the popes prove the Catholic Church can't be of God, well, then the sins of the bad kings of Israel prove that David's throne couldn't have been established by God.
And not only is it true, but the Gospels point it out to make, in a sense, that point, right?
That's right, yeah. We might almost say that the Lord himself, we don't know the reason why our Savior chose Judas Iscariot to be one of the 12.
Which you talk about in the beginning.
It's a pretty deep mystery.
Right.
But I can't help but think that the fact that that even one of 12 turned out to be a devil, Jesus' own words, a devil, and a thief, who all during the ministry of Christ was
helping
taking
himself to the cash. Right.
That's right. There's a parable in there, and that is, expect even ministers that were absolutely, all Christians agree, Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, whatever, I mean, the 12 apostles were handpicked by Christ, so they undoubtedly went out with his authority. and yet one of them was a devil.
Right.
There's a parable there for all of us in every denomination about how to handle or how not to be dismayed by the Judases that spring up
even
among
in Scripture,
us.
it talks about we're not of Paul, we're not of Apollos, we're ultimately Christ, and it's the same idea. That yes, we might follow a particular apostle or somebody and have an attachment, but ultimately that attachment is to Jesus.
Right, that's exactly right.
Right. You say, it's my conviction that if more of us realize just how bad our shepherds really can get and have gotten throughout history, we might, for lack of surprise, be better fortified when these new Judases turn up in our day. So you did this book over a period of time. I'm assuming some of it was happening before some of the things that have been exploding over the last year or so in the Catholic Church. So when that started to happen, were you more fortified because you had already seen this kind of stuff?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. In fact, it's something I sort of hung my hat on. And I thought back to when my mother had told me that there were ministers that made her question her faith. But the interesting thing is, since the book has appeared, I've had several people tell me, several of the early readers have told me, that it, in a strange way, for a book that really is a collection of horror stories, in a strange way, they're all finding it very encouraging. They're saying, I guess I thought that we were seeing the real apocalypse here in the sexual abuse crisis. Right. Now, I'm not saying the apocalypse isn't here. Right. No Catholic can say that because we have to be ready. Right. The second coming could come at any time. Right. But if it is the apocalypse and the end of time, it's not because things have never been this bad before. Right. And that, I guess, is what I'm trying to get across. And that's why people have found it encouraging. They say we're suffering nothing any worse than previous generations of Catholics have had to go through.
You talk about a more nourishing subplot riding side by side with all the tragedy you talk about is the fact that the Catholic laity during the ages under review often shone brightest just when their bad shepherds were at their worst. How so?
Well, several times the faithful laity have saved the church. One of the first stories that I tell in the book is the story of the great Arian crisis of the 4th century, where church historians estimate that as many as 8 or 9 out of every 10 bishoprics in the Christian world were in the hands of a Christological heretic, somebody that was a denier of the divinity of Christ in one way or the other. But Christian historians are also agreed that the laity were never swayed by it. The laity always saw it for what it was, an attempt to make Christianity more palatable to the Roman public, to ease the transition from paganism to...
We talk about the rump of Roman paganism.
That's right, yeah, trying to survive in a Christian-flavored form. And that really is what Arianism was. But that period, and I wrote about it previously in my book, The Apostasy That Wasn't. The great lesson of that period is how the faithful stayed faithful and outlasted the bad shepherds.
Right. You talk about Arian quislings.
That's maybe a good way to say it. They were collaborating with the government.
Well, you were saying, I guess, and when you talk about it with having to do with post-Constantine and his son, etc., the idea that many times these people were being basically appointed by the politicians, and they really weren't religious people at all. They were being put into being a bishop or etc. Right? There really wasn't.
Well, that happens sometimes, but it is.
You also have people who voted the right way at Nicaea who decided to change their mind later.
That's right. Yeah, it's not quite as it'd be nice to think that they were all, but there were traitors too. Just like Judas sat through every sermon in the Gospels, and yet did what he did. So it'd be comforting to us to believe that they were all wolves in sheep's. Well, I suppose they were, but all not real Christians to begin with. And I'm afraid that's not going to wash.
So at one point in time, the Nicene Fathers had all either fled, been compromised, been imprisoned, or apostatized themselves and joined the enemy. And anti-pope sat upon the chair of Peter. And Athanasius, the little man whose little book may have started the whole war, huddled in a cave in the desert, sheltered by hermits and goat herds. And that's where the status of the church was. Right?
Yes, that's right. In other words, whatever we may be going through now, we're not in a church where most of the higher clergy are heretics.
You say cowardness is the key word. How so?
Yeah, because it seems that the motivation of the clergy who did turn Arian it seems that their motivation was they were worried that the Constantine's experiment wouldn't last, and that the Roman popes were coming back. The Roman emperors were coming back.
Okay.
And so they were desperate to make Constantine's experiment in the Christian empire work permanently, and as a result, they did all sorts of bad compromises with paganism to make that happen. But it was the desire to save their own skins and their own living that seems to have driven most of them.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing we get too attached, as they say, and you say earlier in the book, too focused on this world and not enough on the next. You also talk about Arianism. You move into the barbarian bishops of the Dark Ages, and you talk about lingering Arianism and how that impacted the beginning of Islam, and how the prophet of Islam simply took Arian difficulties about the Trinity to their logical conclusion by denying the divinity of Christ altogether.
Right. People don't realize that the degree to which Islam is a Christian heresy.
Right.
Muhammad was a pretty simple camel herder in Arabia, and the fallout from the previous crisis affected him. Right. He lived in a land where there were three different types of religious people: Jews, whom he was familiar with, the old remnants of the old Arabian paganism that existed before Islam, and bad Arian Christians, or Christianity where the Christology was defective in one way or the other. And as a result, he knew almost no real Christians.
Right.
And a whole new destructive movement that still troubles the world today arose from the fact that Muhammad was living in a post-Aryan crisis world, the fallout from it.
It's interesting, you make the point too of the fact that people sometimes think about Arianism, well, Jesus isn't God, as opposed to, well, there was a time when he wasn't, was the initial issue, and how that slid from that to him not being divine.
Right.
It was a slippery slope, really, right?
Right. As soon as you start compromising, the next compromise gets easier. So
you also said, and I thought this was interesting, because one of the things is, obviously a lot of North Africa and were Christian, or quote unquote Christian, or Arian Christian, or Christian, and now the church disappeared. You say Catholic clergymen were too often high livers in other ways also, and at a time when the laity was crushed by rampant usury and impossibly high taxation. And then you say the armies of the prophet, on the other hand, brought instant liberation wherever their message was accepted, for Islam prohibited any Muslim from taking usury or keeping a slave.
Right. Slowness to reform is one of the themes. Reform is difficult. You have to get up off of your easy living, and reform is always trouble for clergy. And as a result, some of them, even if they're not actually involved in the abuse themselves, don't want to rock the boat too bad and cause trouble. So as a result, slowness to reform often leads to whole new crises of its own. And that's the essence of that problem.
Is competition that comes into play, and people see another alternative.
Christianity let slavery linger for far too long. It was universal in the Roman world that Christianity was born into, but it should have been gone by the 6th century when Muhammad came along and preached complete abolition, and it wasn't.
Right.
Similarly, the financial abuses that were still rampant amongst supposedly
now,
Christian
was the
men.
abolition preached by Islam at the time just for if you converted to Islam, you couldn't be a slave, but there was obviously a slave trade that Islam, or parts of it, were involved in. So.
Like every, we had one too.
Right, exactly.
Like every religion, there's a difference many times between what's preached and what's actually suffered to continue.
Right. So freebooters and miters, is that how you view it?
Well, that certainly was the case when we got to these resistors of reform, as I've called them. Many of them were like the man who Luther protested against. Everybody knows that Luther nailed up his 95 Theses. Right. But most people don't know that they were all directed against indulgences. And really, most
You
people
talk about Tetzel.
That's right. Really, most people don't know. Everybody says, well, one person out of 100 may know that the indulgences were supposed to help pay for the new St. Peter's Basilica, the one that's there now.
Right.
But actually, hardly anybody knows that only half of the money from the indulgences was going to that. The Archbishop had made an arrangement with the Pope beforehand that he should keep half the money in order to pay off his own personal debts that he acquired in issuing bribes so that he could be bishop of 3 different bishoprics at once. So a horrible abuse.
Right.
The thing Luther, yes, he had arguments about the theology of indulgences, but it really was an abuse, and we all agree now that it was an abuse. Not indulgences themselves, but how they were being given at that time.
And even at that day, we were saved by Orthodoxy's G.I. Joes?
That's right, yeah. This is my way of saying, we have one period that I talk about where I don't have specific examples to give of Catholic lay people who saved the day. But we know they must have been there during the Dark Ages because so many of, say, St. Benedict's recruits for the new Benedictine order were from the common people, from barbarians, really, in the fallen Roman Empire. And those, we don't know their names, like we don't know the names of many of the heroes in World War II. But we know that they must have been there because there'd have been nobody to recruit from otherwise.
And also because the faith kept on.
Yeah.
Even in spite of all of this, and even talk about one of the cruelest ironies about the Black Death is the way it contributed so heavily to the deterioration of the clergy. And I make this point here because we'd like to think everybody charged in and did the right thing, but you say the faithful bishop, the loyal priest, the dutiful deacon, all ministered as long as they could, then died. The cowards and deserters fled and survived to practically the whole clergy in the post-plague years. So it's not only the fact that we lost these men, but we lost the good men.
Right.
We ended up with the guys who weren't willing to sacrifice themselves.
I make a comparison to 9/11, where while everybody else was running out of the Twin Towers, the firemen and the other helpers were rushing in. The good clergy during the Black Death, probably the most terrible pandemic in world history, they went into the plague zones knowing that most people who went in there got the plague and died, and yet they did their duty anyway.
Right.
But the result was the clergy was decimated, and the people who became the clergy of the next generation were the people who ran.
Right. You also talked about something called a mass priest. What's a mass priest?
That's interesting, yeah. After the crisis was over, you had to recruit new clergy quickly because probably the percentage of clergymen who perished in the Black Death was actually higher than lay people, and that was probably 50% in some parts of Europe. So imagine 50% of your priests and deacons and bishops gone all at once. You have to have a pretty big recruiting effort afterward, and they didn't have much to work with. So as a result, a lot of men were hastily ordained, and that they became what were called the mass priests because that's literally all they did was recite the Mass because they had no training. Many of them couldn't read, didn't know how to preach, didn't know how to teach the faith. So that's one of the reasons many of the abuses that Luther encountered a couple hundred years later.
Gives you an idea how important the Mass is.
That's right.
Really, in maintaining it. Yeah. In Chapter 4, the Catholic Protestants, the great 16th century rebels and those who drove them to revolt, you make the point, it ought to go without saying, but all the men who created Protestantism were Catholics. Right. And, Wycliffe, Huss were Catholic university professors. Luther was a doctor of theology. Zwingli was a Swiss priest. Calvin had been a seminarian. Why do you think it's important for us to understand all these people had this Catholic underpinning?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, it's true, just a plain fact, that most of our great heresies were invented by Catholic clergy, as hard as that is to say. But the point I'm making here, I do call out the Protestants as bad shepherds, because many of them were clergy. Right. But I move beyond that to say that they were driven to it in many cases. Not that there's ever an excuse for sundering the body of Christ, but we Catholics also, you were talking about triumphalism. We sometimes forget that these men were sorely goaded because the clergy the clergy they dealt with were
Right.
terrible, most of them.
Right. The issue is what they ultimately did, and then ultimately how that moved ahead, sometimes of their own volition, because of their own deciding that I knew better than you, etc. You say
Right.
what Luther had felt, Calvin explained. Calvin was Mr. Spock to Luther's Dr. McCoy. That's an interesting insight.
Yeah, he's Luther is a harder guy to hate than Calvin is. I say hate. We try not to hate.
You have
But
concerns about.
he's a more likable fellow.
How long did it take you to write this book?
From the time that I first started working on the ideas and researching the ideas behind it, that's probably been 4 or 5 years.
Was that your idea, or did somebody come and say, "This would be why don't you write a book on something like
Well,
this?"
to tell, I was asked, do you have something in mind on this topic? Because we would like to go ahead with a book along these lines. And I said, well, it just so happens that I have been working on something. So,
Are you working on something else?
Yeah, I am, as a matter of fact. But it's a book that I may have mentioned last time we were here about some of the early heresies, Marcion in particular.
Okay, very good. Well, stop back again when you have that book completed. Thanks for being on Father Mitch's show back in January as well. Always a pleasure to see you.
Always fun. Thank
Okay,
you.
talking to Rod Bennett. Interesting book, Bad Shepherds, The Dark Years in Which the Faithful Thrived While Bishops Did the Devil's Work, published by our friends at Sophia Institute Press, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. Very interesting, very eye-opening. Check it out. Join us next time right here on Bookmark. Thanks.